Good morning, and thanks for getting up so early to come hear me. In recent years, various officials of the United States government have been critical of European approaches to organizations variously called sects, cults, minority or alternative religions, and new religious movements. Several European countries, Belgium, France, Germany, and Sweden, and Switzerland, have commissioned national studies of these groups. Scientology's battles in France, Greece, Belgium, and especially Germany have gained considerable American press, and additional battles are brewing between Jehovah's Witnesses and several European states. A human rights court, however, did rule in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses regarding their right to proselytize in Greece, which shows that the groups themselves occasionally benefit from a human rights focus. As background for understanding these Euro-American debates over the religious human rights of non-mainstream sectarian groups, several events of significance are worth keeping in mind. First and foremost, is the fall of the Berlin Wall in late 1989, which opened up new and fertile territory to religious proselytizers. Some of the proselytizers who rushed into these countries demonstrated remarkable cultural insensitivity by disregarding the language, customs, and histories of their new host countries. A few of these countries, however, were so eager for Western input that they welcomed Western-based proselytizers with open arms. Scientology, for example, scored early successes with some of its secular programs in Russia and Albania. Second, large religious bodies in formerly communist countries had to redefine themselves, either because they no longer could maintain identities as opposition movements, such as was the case with the Catholic Church in Poland, or because the previous endorsement that they had from now disfavored regimes was a social burden. Thank you. Many Western religious rights advocates, for example, charged that the Russian Orthodox Church is trying to protect its newly legitimized status. It is doing so, the critics charge, by supporting a law that severely restricts the access that new religions have for proselytization opportunities in its country. Third, many European countries have variations on what amount to state-sanctioned churches. Germany, Scandinavian countries, the United Kingdom, Greece, and so on demonstrate variations on this arrangement. Some of these churches run cult monitoring organizations, and some of them, like in Germany, have close relations with the state. Fourth, non-traditional groups that are out of the mainstream and that demonstrate various degrees of tension with society, have a long history in Europe. Various established sects from the United States, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Scientists, Mormons, Pentecostal organizations, and so on, have been recruiting in Europe long before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Consequently, they have well-established infrastructures and histories in various countries. Some of them, however, are encountering close scrutiny and opposition in present times. Fifth, many of the new religions and/or sectarian groups active in the New Europe are American-based. Their headquarters are in the U.S., and many of the proselytizers are Americans. Sixth, the United States has signed but not ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, among other human rights treaties that they have not signed. The American failure to do so puts it at odds with all of the European countries. Consequently, America and Europe hold each other to somewhat different standards on some very crucial human rights issues. American government officials are reluctant to sign treaties that would place the U.S. under the control of international agencies. Seventh, some European countries have constitutionally and legally unique obligations that their governments must fulfill when dealing with these groups. The German government, for example, must maintain a militant protection of the free democratic basic order, which thereby obligates officials to monitor and, if necessary, take action against anti-democratic organizations in that country. France has a 1905 law that requires the separation of church and state and gives the government the possibility of describing religious groups either as non-taxable associations of worship or taxable cultural associations. Both in this case and in the context of human rights issues, however, the French government has initiated actions that identify 173 groups which it believes are in opposition to the public order due to their totalitarianism, violations of fundamental liberties, inordinate emphasis upon finances, and so on. These identifications have put the country at odds with the State Department. This opposition from the State Department comes partly because the groups themselves had no opportunity to challenge the sect designation that the French Commission assigned to it. Eighth, while Europeans certainly are aware of the major sectarian tragedies that happen occasionally around the world, Jonestown, on Shinrikyo, Heaven's Gate, and so on, Europe has had a few tragedies and close calls of its own. 21 of the 85 Branch Davidians who died at Mount Carmel in 1993 were British citizens. And most of the 74 murder-suicide victims of the Order of the Solar Temple, who died at various times from late 1994 to early 1997, were Swiss and French. Several, of course, were Canadians. Authorities believe that they narrowly averted disaster in 1998 when Spanish police arrested a sect leader, 26 adults, and 5 children on the Isle of Tenerife. Allegedly, its members believed that the end of the world was destined to occur at 8 p.m. on January 8th, and that their souls would be picked up by spacecraft and transported to another planet. Regarding yet another group on Shinrikyo, some accounts suggest that the group received help on its sarin gas work from impoverished and corrupted members of the Russian military. Finally, we must remember that much of Europe has experienced totalitarianism in the forms of Nazism and communism that make these countries especially concerned about anti-democratic ideologies. With these points as backgrounds, permit me to present several issues that may help identify some of the reasons for tension between the European countries and the United States on religious human rights issues. Several European countries are concerned about the excessive access that some controversial religions have to American policymakers. Europeans believe that these controversial religions are providing American policymakers with information that often is questionable in content and accuracy. They also believe that this questionable information overshadows the facts and interpretations that the Europeans themselves try to provide. Examples abound of what the Europeans mean. Well known, for example, are the politically conservative circles in which Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church operates. And most commentators realize the political power that its conservative newspaper, the Washington Times, has among some policymakers. 2 former American presidents, George Bush and Gerald Ford, have spoken at Moon-sponsored conferences, as have 5 senators, Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, Jesse Helms, Republican from North Carolina, Jack Kemp, Republican from New York, Richard Lugar, Republican from Indiana, and Pete Wilson, Republican from California. Although in comparison to Europe, the Unification Church's influence has been greater in other parts of the world, such as Latin America and Asia, It has entered the European religious rights debate through conferences sponsored by one of its organizations, the International Coalition for Religious Freedom. The International Coalition for Religious Freedom has held 4 conferences in Berlin, Washington, Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Tokyo. They pull together what sometimes is an impressive array of academics, middle-level or former government officials, non-governmental organizations, and lobby groups such as the influential Freedom House, along with representatives from controversial religions themselves. Some observers are not bothered by these conferences, claiming that the Unification Church does not control the content of speeches. I know a person who's gone to these conferences, and I asked him why he went, and he said, well, they continue to invite me back, even though I go there and criticize the Unification Church's activities in my country, he said. Other people say that at least the Unification Church is thinking about human rights concepts. What concerns some European officials, however, is that the sponsoring organization, the Unification Church, is directed by a convicted American felon who advocates a theocratic government, one that would be inimical to various human rights standards. By far the most controversial religious human rights lobby that has impacted American foreign policy in Europe is comprised of Scientology's Hollywood celebrities. Their access to political decision makers has diminished the stature of American foreign policy relations officials in the eyes of their German counterparts, and also probably in the eyes of other informed Europeans. In 1996 and 1997, a Scientology affiliate in Los Angeles was paying $725,000 to a Washington-based firm to lobby Congress on Scientology's behalf, working with 3 particular Scientology celebrities, John Travolta, Isaac Hayes, and Chick Corea. This lobby firm helped to arrange a number of high-profile meetings on Capitol Hill. What irritates European officials so much, especially the Germans, is that these Scientologists have official public relations titles inside the Scientology organization itself. The founder of Scientology is L. Ron Hubbard, often abbreviated to LRH, and all 3 of these celebrities are LRH public relations officers. As LRH public relations officers, these people have the assignment to help make LRH's accomplishments in technology known to the public. They do so through such activities as radio and television talk shows, letters to newspapers, magazines, and professional journals, and meetings with civic leaders. Probably through the efforts of the high-paid Scientology lobbyist, Travolta, Hayes, and Correa made presentations before the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, often called the Helsinki Commission, in September 1997. A photographer for a New York newspaper captured the chairman of the Helsinki Commission at the time, Alphonse D'Amato, hugging Travolta on the day on which Travolta testified about persecution of Scientologists at the hearing. Earlier in 1997, Bill Clinton happened to meet Travolta at a conference in Philadelphia, and the president told Travolta that he wanted to help him with Scientology's problems in Germany. He followed up on that promise by arranging for the White House political affairs director to set up a briefing with Travolta and other Scientologists with National Security Advisor Sandy Berger. Even before Travolta and Clinton met, an exclusive article that Clinton wrote about drug use appeared in Scientology's propaganda magazine in France. Perhaps France and also Germany, and I think Switzerland as well. Perhaps the most incendiary event involving celebrities was the open letter to Chancellor Helmut Kohl in January 1997 that equated the German government's handling of Scientology with Nazis' persecution of Jews prior to World War II. Many of the 34 Hollywood celebrities who signed it had close ties to prominent Scientologists Travolta and Tom Cruise, and German officials were infuriated with the letter. Indeed, to their credit, the State Department and the Secretary of State denounced the Nazi comparison. Seen in context, however, with the Scientology celebrity lobby, all of these incidents indicated to the Germans that the American foreign policy toward their country about religious human rights was being unduly influenced by what many critics cleverly call Scientology wood. While the Scientology lobby has had a surprising impact inside the United States, intense lobbying on part of various interested parties also occurs on international levels. For example, the Italian-based group CESNUR has had high-level contacts in Europe and the United States, while critics insist that its information is biased in favor of the controversial groups. The Council of Europe became so concerned about the availability of biased information from this lobbying by various groups and people that it recently passed a resolution stating, "It is of prime importance to have reliable information on these groups that emanates neither exclusively from the sects themselves nor from associations set up to defend the victims of sects." Consequently, the Council has recommended that the governments of member states, where necessary, to set up or support independent national or regional information centers on groups of a religious, esoteric, or spiritual nature. To some American officials, it is unthinkable that governments would collect information on religion. From a European standpoint, however, these centers may be the best way to control the quality of information that government officials, law enforcement, and the general public receive. France, Austria, and Belgium already have these state-sponsored organizations. Another reason that the Council of Europe has called for government-funded information centers may be because it has learned from the American experience that privately run so-called cult information organizations are extremely vulnerable both to infiltration by sect-planted spies and to destruction by the very groups that they attempt to monitor. Indeed, many of the controversial new religions are really multifaceted transnationals that have ready access to enormous resources, far more than any cult information or cult monitoring private agency could ever muster. The American example of the Cult Awareness Network provides Europeans with a negative model, a worst-case scenario that occurred when a cult monitoring agency lacked state protection. To simplify a complicated story that no doubt many people know in this room very well, Scientologists bankrupted the Cult Awareness Network through legal challenges and finally a court case, then acquired its name, logo, phone number, and files as part of the bankruptcy payment. All the while, Scientology had a plant in the Cult Awareness Network office who was filing secret reports about the organization's strategies to avoid bankruptcy. The personal correspondence that distraught parents or former members sent to the Cult Awareness Network now is in the hands of its greatest enemy, Scientology. And the new Cult Awareness Network directors have offered to turn over the files to the respective groups themselves. This kind of gross violation of privacy and confidentiality would not happen if the European nations have governmentally sponsored monitoring and information sharing agencies, as has been recommended by the French, the Germans, the Belgians, and the Council of Europe. Beyond issues of inappropriate lobbying and the need to fund national or regional centers, European officials are troubled by the lack of awareness that State Department officials have about crimes and religious human rights abuses that occur on American soil, and that they, the European officials, are trying to protect their citizens against. The most dramatic case in point involves the knowledge that many European government officials have about Scientology's operation of forced labor and reindoctrination programs in California and Florida. For that matter, similar programs run in England and Denmark. These abusive programs, named the Rehabilitation Project Force, or simply RPF, involve forcible confinement, physical coercion, social and psychological degradations, obligatory confessions, and hard labor, which the Scientology organization imposes upon its most committed but deviating or poorly performing members. Especially because of Germany's mid-century history, it will never grant Scientology religious status as long as it operates forced labor RPF programs anywhere in the world. When, however, members of a German parliamentary commission on sects brought up the RPF in a 1998 meeting with the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, this State Department official had no idea what the commission members were talking about. Hints at the German frustration over the Americans' lack of knowledge on this subject came out in quotes given by the German chairperson of the delegation. She told a reporter, "The knowledge of some U.S. representatives about the totalitarian aspect of Scientology is limited. With time, the USA will also come to the realization that this is about an anti-democratic and anti-pluralistic organization, and then a country like America will have to wake up." On the issue of children's rights, the American refusal to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child continues to allow Europeans to charge that the U.S. has not paid the kind of appropriate attention to child protection issues as they, the Europeans, are attempting to do. For example, in 1998, two American researchers, one of whom was Rita Swan, who unfortunately could not speak this morning, published an article entitled "Child Fatalities from Religion-Motivated Medical Neglect," which concluded, when faith healing is used to the exclusion of medical treatments, the number of preventable child fatalities and the associated suffering are substantial and warrant public concern. Existing laws may be inadequate to protect children from this form of medical neglect. The authors identified 23 religious groups in the United States that held core beliefs of medical care avoidance. And after the study was published, the authors discovered an American church that has buried 78 children since 1955 in its own graveyard, and another one that had 12 children die in less than a 20-year period. Once again, the American experience has taught that the state must take a role in protecting some children from the faith of their parents. And some European national reports on sects have discussed the need to protect children in this regard. Remarkable to the Europeans is that American legislation specifically exempts children from necessary medical care on religious grounds. The 1996 Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act specifically states, "Nothing in this act shall be construed as establishing a federal requirement that a parent or legal guardian provide a child any medical service or treatment against the religious beliefs of the parent or legal guardian." Almost certainly this clause is the result of lobbying by the Christian Science Church, which in the past has included such high-profile lobbyists and lawyers as the eventual White House prosecutor Kenneth Starr and future Secretary of State Warren Christopher. By contrast, European nations have committed themselves to protecting children from medical neglect caused by parents, which partially explains the difficulties that some European Jehovah's Witnesses are facing. The example of religious exemptions for children's medical treatment in the U.S. has led some European officials to wonder about the extent to which a few American groups are attempting to cloak criminal or harmful activities behind claims of religious protection on national and international levels. This cynical perspective gained credence in a recent Time magazine article that mentioned the unexpected impact of a Florida religious liberty protection law. In that state, a Scientology organization is facing criminal charges that involve the unlawful practice of medicine, which, by the way, is a major issue in France, Italy, and Spain, and the abuse or neglect of a disabled adult. We heard about this case last evening. These charges stem from the death of Scientologist Lisa McPherson, and a related civil case against Scientology also has been filed. McPherson died in 1995 after being in Scientology's care, so-called, for 17 days. Scientology, however, is arguing that these cases interfere with its right to practice its faith, which is now protected by state statute. By extension, many European officials are concerned that the staunch American focus on what it considers to be international human rights issues may provide legal cover for American-based organizations that are involved in harmful or criminal actions in their respective European countries. And this concern is indeed legitimate. In conclusion, let me emphasize that many European officials feel that some American policymakers have been unable to hear the concerns that various European nations have about the link between human rights defense and human rights violations. Many religions, after all, have long traditions of intolerance themselves, and they allow restrictions upon their members that seem antithetical to the free operation of democratic, tolerant states. Indeed, if we look at the possible range of human rights abuses that a few controversial religions commit, and we really have no idea how many, we come up with quite a list. First, we know that some groups exploit members and others financially by placing demands upon congregants' resources that are injurious to the donors, based upon deceptive claims, and are coercive. Second, some leaders in controversial new religions use their positions of trust to sexually exploit their members. These leaders violate access to privacy that their positions allow toward members. They claim that sex with them is part of spiritual training or counseling, and generally they take advantage of people who see their supposed spirituality as elevating them above the level of mere sexual pleasure. Third, new controversial ideologies can physically abuse their members through excessive work regimes and other forms of physical maltreatment. Fourth, medical abuse in some, especially new religions, is commonplace, in which leaders deny medical treatment that likely would reduce serious illness or prevent death. And this prevention, as with the other human rights that I mentioned, or violations, has significant human rights consequences. Some controversial religions perpetrate emotional or psychological abuse on members by denying opportunities for love, affection, or touching, by attacking people's self-esteem, or by imposing odd psychological theories on group members. And again, prohibitions against this kind of activity appears in various human rights conventions. Sixth, some new religions can educationally abuse members, but especially children, by denying them exposure to information and by denying them opportunities to reach degrees, even high school diplomas, that they need to function in society. Seventh, some groups willfully malnourish their members. That is, they deliberately deny members adequate food, sometimes in the context of punishment. Eighth, some new religions abuse their members and others religiously by forcing continued adherence to the faith through use of fear and threats. And this kind of forced religion is specifically outlawed in various human rights conventions. Ninth, some members of groups abuse their children through neglectful child rearing, as happened when parents are too busy with a religion's demands or so trusting of its leaders that they fail to look after the children. 10th, as organizations, new religions can muster wealth and resources to subvert justice by abusing the legal system. The fear of subversion of the social order and an infiltration in various government agencies is one that's been particularly strong amongst French and German officials. 11th, new religions can commit professional violations against members by advising or counseling people in such a manner that harms them. 12th, many controversial religions seemingly commit labor violations, working members long hours without providing adequate salaries, benefits, and work conditions. And again, labor violations are specifically covered in various human rights conventions. 13th, some controversial religions neglect the elderly, often after years of taking their money and resources and talents. One of the crises we will begin seeing, and I think we've already seen it for people who know the activities of some groups, is in regard to the condition of the elderly. Some of these groups, the groups that hit my generation, the groups that attracted members in the early 70s, now have people in their 50s, and when we start hitting our 60s and our 70s, as some Scientologists already have, we will see severe crises regarding the care of the elderly, because few, if any, of these groups have programs in place for their care and their health in their elderly days. Having said all this, and having pointed out that the Europeans have some legitimate concerns about the American approach to human rights issues, I fully expect that at some time in the future, European religious human rights officials will wax biblical when responding to their American colleagues. Judge not, lest ye be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your relative's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? If the Leo J. Ryan Educational Foundation wants an organizational focus, then I suggest that a human rights focus would be an important one. Pressure on American government officials to ratify human rights treaties is potentially a campaign issue, especially since 2 of the unratified treaties involve the rights of women and children. Moreover, this focus would place the organization on high moral ground and bring it in contact with organizations around the world that are fighting for human dignity on a global scale. Thanks very much.
At this time, we'd like to take some questions. We'll be circulating. We have board members circulating with cards to write them on, and then we'll take them up and bring them up. While we're waiting for those to come up, I will make an announcement that I should have made starting off. We like to point out for those that are new to conferences, for if you've been to a lot of conferences, you know this already, but we do have people in attendance who are opposed to cult awareness and would like nothing better than to silence their critics and stop meetings like this from happening in the future. We say this not to make you paranoid, but just to make you aware that they may be sitting at your table, they may be standing next to you or chatting friendly with you in the hallways, and we just urge you to exercise caution in your approach with people that you don't know.
Here's one question. How much support have you encountered in the American academic community for your work and views? A debate exists in the American academic community over the very issue of abuse in controversial religions and their implications of abuse for human rights issues. I've been in some printed debates with colleagues. Only a handful of academics are concerned about the issue of so-called new religions and human rights. And amongst the few of us who are, great diversity exists about whose rights are being violated and whose rights are being protected. So it's quite a hot issue, but judging by even the few academics who are here, there aren't many of us dealing with it. So I'll leave my answer there. We can talk some more later. Is there any change in the tendency for sociologists to take the cult apologist stance? Debate exists on the internet about the extent to which sociologists have been defenders of several controversial groups. Over the last couple of years, this debate about the position regarding abuse in these groups has hit not only publications, both academic and popular, but also has become the focus of several conference presentations and academic settings, and also a book that's coming out next year. So I think a change exists. Because sociologists started recognizing and doing theoretical work on abuse in organizational structures like the Catholic Church in the context of pedophilia, those same models apply very well to smaller ideological organizations and their potentially abusive structures. So I think a change is going on right now. On a national level, how exactly can we help politically? I'd make a couple of suggestions. As I understand, nonprofit and charitable organizations cannot support candidates, but they can take positions on issues. It would be very important for people to go to candidates who are running for office, be well informed about the kinds of human rights positions that the Americans have not yet ratified, and bring these issues to public attention. Not only can this awareness be done in political meetings, but also through media, through writings, through newspaper interviews, and so on. Raising the profile, using public pressure, indeed social embarrassment. It is outrageous in many ways that the United States has failed to ratify so many important treaties. Making those issues public may have an impact. Who should we be contacting to insist on more human rights protection? Senate, Congress, Council of Churches, etc. Who's most effective? I'm not sure. Well, eventually the Congress and senators, I'm not quite sure how the political system works, has to make the ratification. But various lobby groups, including a wide range of non-governmental human rights organizations, already have existing lobbying structures in Washington. What might be important is to make sure that existing human rights organizations know about the kinds of abuses that some groups perpetrate on their members. There have been a number of human rights reports, for example, that were very critical of Scientology's position in Germany. Indeed, the United States State Department, for a number of years, was very critical. And I know one person who started sending human rights information to one of the critical non-governmental organizations, and eventually that organization stopped making those criticisms. So it's not only lobbying government, it's also lobbying the existing human rights organizations. Okay, my ex-husband was formerly a member of the chief of staff of this particular controversial group. It was policy to target high-profile politicians to get their attendance at these international conferences. There was strategy and prayer behind getting them to attend. This increased the stature of this particular group. It was done at any cost with members' money. And one of the issues about conferences sponsored, for example, by the Unification Church, has to do with where the money comes from. So when my colleagues say we are free to say at those conferences anything we like, I have no doubt they're telling you the truth. The issue they don't address, however, is how the organization gets the money to pay for their plane flights. For anyone who knows about how the Unification Church gets some of its money, there are a lot of questions and a lot of ethical, perhaps human rights issues involving fundraising. So a lot of us have decided that regardless of freedom of expression in the meetings, ethical issues exist about the funding to get to those meetings. So perhaps the wise academic position is that if academics want to go to those conferences and speak freely, fine, let them pay their own way. Let them go to the conferences in ways that are not funded by the organizations themselves, which means that ordinary members are not breaking their backs to raise funds that are used on the academics' behalf. Has Eileen Barker and her organization Inform participated on the side of the cults in their attempts to influence the State Department in dealings about cults with European governments? I'm trying to sort out how to even begin with the question. Inform is an organization in Europe that was receiving governmental information in order for this organization to provide what it claimed was objective information about so-called cults and new religions. The critics claimed that the information that they got on some groups was biased in favor of groups. There was one instance in a radio program where members, people who had British citizens in the Church of Scientology claimed that the information Inform provided them was not British information that would have been highly critical of Scientology, but was in fact information probably from an American who was supportive. I've heard some other criticisms about the information. I must say in Eileen's defense, however, that when the family, the Children of God, blocked an academic publication of mine, and an academic worked in collusion with the Children of God in that blocked attempt, Eileen Barker wrote the academic in protest against his actions. Eileen is one of the few sociologists right now who at least is engaged in dialogue with people like me in an attempt to understand the issue about abuse and the controversies that exist amongst them. She's gone now to, I believe, 2 American Family Foundation conferences, and she's scheduled to go to a 3rd one in the end of April. So Inform still goes on. I'm not sure how active she has been involved in it. It was controversial. Britain is a complicated country. There were many pre-existing so-called anti-cult or cult information organizations, and many were jealous, and all of them were critical of the groups. They were jealous and angry and very critical of the kind of information Eileen Barker's group provided. What do you think can be done to counteract the effect movie stars such as John Travolta and Tom Cruise have on the opinions of our government officials and the public in general? People who have watched American politics, and especially during the Clinton administration, know the growing connections between Hollywood and Washington. Some of that connection comes because of the amount of money that exists in Hollywood and the expense of contemporary American political campaigns. It's a roundabout way to go about these issues, but campaign finance reform seems crucial. All political candidates spend years lobbying Hollywood. And so that influence is really quite crucial. The other way, I think, to counteract it is to work with existing human rights lobbyists who already have access to Washington and make sure that some people who hold different opinions about the abuses that some groups commit gain access to organizations like the Helsinki Commission. That is to say, Scientology has a lobbyist in Washington whose sole job is to gain access and influence. And the way to counteract that, I think, is through effective lobbying, and we can't and shouldn't in a democracy exclude contrary voices. What we have to make sure, however, is that our own voice, or the voice of people who are concerned about abuses, also is heard, and heard very clearly. Let me see. I think it does the specificity of this conference and this field of study find pertinence for the general human rights agenda, such as publicized by Amnesty International? And if so, wouldn't it serve us to have a larger perspective? I think a large perspective is crucial. One of the advantages of having Julia as executive director is that she reads and speaks German fluently. Consequently, she is able to communicate with a large portion of the European audience. I think also she can read French as well. So the organization is in a rare position to have someone who can dialogue with people overseas. And that often hasn't been the case with so-called cult information groups. So a broad perspective is important. My own experience is that sometimes American organizations are self-contained, don't look too much outside of American borders, and fail to see a much larger context. America is a very important country in this new religions, human rights debate, but it's not the only country and the only perspective. So as broad as this organization can become, everybody will benefit.
Are there any other questions? We want to thank Dr. Kent for coming. He's
students don't do that for me.